And Bradley is going to talk about creative cross-pollination. So yeah, whenever you want, the floor is yours.
All right, so thank you all. There are some challenges, but also some advantages to being the last person to speak. Of course, we will have closing comments by Duncan, but one thing that happens is some of your prepared presentation remarks become obsolete. And so I'll be skipping through some of the slides a little bit fast, but there are other references in particular to other panelists and speakers that I'd like to integrate. So I will start by saying, Roman Jakobson, this weekend was a great illustration many times of the phatic function, fourth function of language. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes, yes. So after having named Jacobson, I will now proceed to my actual topic, creative cross-pollination. And to further distinguish my presentation from others that are more analytical in the sense of presenting statistical analysis, I am merely speaking as an educator who teaches translation in various capacities, and my attempt is to show you or to share some exercises I have done and at least anecdotally explain to what extent that produced some good insights. So, literary translation, self-evident and neural machine translation, and close readings of a third kind. This is an indirect reference, a new addition to my title to Francois' presentation yesterday. If you were listening in, you will know that she was very emphatic about the ability to read in the target language. And of course, a close reading may traditionally be connected to hermeneutics. And I would like to suggest that post-editing is also a kind of close reading. Whether or not that is an alien encounter could be up for debate. So another nod to a fellow translation speaker today, Klaas talked about the biographical turn, and in keeping with that, I will give some personal background as to why I had this particular perspective. The second point will be talking about my students with whom I normally interact, how they view neural machine translation and literary translation in particular. And finally, the professional technical translators that I interacted with in 2 workshop settings, February of 2020 and October, will be the third element of my talk. Great. So, I grew up in rural Kansas, studied German literature, stayed in Germany for various reasons, and in 2007 I started a MA in Translation Studies. The name of the place where I studied was the Institute für angewandte Linguistik und Translatologie, or basically I was doing applied translation with only limited exposure to literary translation. Some of the seminars that I took and completed, obviously, included instruction in and working with CAT tools such as Trados, Mimikyu, and WordFast. So this is a background. And then when I became tired of doing terms and conditions, birth certificates, and other technical translation, I switched my focus to literary and cultural related translations. In particular, the summer school I attended at BCLT in 2011 was a catalyst for that move. And nearly at the same time, I started a teaching position at Leipzig University. However, that was mostly restricted to the English department, and my students are generally becoming teachers later on. This led me to the question, do I get to bid farewell to technology-based approaches to translation? Without having the reference of the last bastion, I would still think, looking back, I was hopeful that I would be able to just put all that in my past. However, in 2016-17, there were two big shifts, as you all know, I assume, based on the presentations you've already held or listened to. There was Google Translation, which switched to neural translation in 2016 and currently supports over 100 languages, and DeepL, which was launched in 2017, originally was 7 European languages and now 24. One reason why I have used DeepL for my exercise is that it's very widely known within Germany, where I'm based, and also it's free, so open source in a way. Or if you use it extensively, you need to purchase a not very expensive subscription. So after having encountered these tools and wondering, is this relevant? Is this the water that we swim in? I came up with some let's see if I can move this down here. Is this, how do I move the bar?
I was able to do it.
with one, drag and drop, okay. There we go. Double click, right. At the bottom, very good. So in 2017, I attended the European School of Literary Translation, of course, related to the PETRA-E network. And that was an inspiration to apply some literary translation exercises to my normal student hostages, population, whatever you want to call them. They were forced to do translation with me, and I will share with you 2 examples from that setting. First of all, in the past couple of years, I took a short excerpt from a contemporary German novel, which I happen to have been translating myself. It's really worth reading, and there is a translator who makes a brief appearance. His name is not Brad, but has a number of characteristics that are similar to me. And what I did was I divided the students into 2 groups. One was encouraged or told to either use Google Translate or DeepL, and one was not allowed to. The post-edited neural machine translation, student translations had fewer simple mistakes. So, but there were many mistakes that were ultimately, in my opinion, tied to misreadings of the source text. Pure human translation groups had greater stylistic coherence, but more syntax and punctuation errors. Then a second example here, and unfortunately you can't see Kafka's book because I'm in the way, was an exercise taking a classic canonical text, a portion from Kafka's Metamorphosis or Die Verwandlung as a source text. And first I tasked them with post-editing or close reading an NMT version. I then pivoted to an analysis of 2 existing English translations. And what I observed was that these complex texts offer a variety of translation possibilities, and that while the source text is not notably historical, in other words, when you're reading it, it doesn't seem terribly antiquated, but it does reveal differences in translation that may be due to historically evolved approaches to translation. And the students had heated debates about the source language, the source text and the target text. Just to give an example from the first line, and here we see als Gregor Samson eines Morgens aus unruhigen Träumen erwachte, fand er in seinem Bett zu einem ungeheuren Ungeziefer verwandelt. I've highlighted the two most common variants, how you translate unruhig as uneasy, unsettling, troubled, or restless is one example that you would be able to say, that is a good question. And at first glance, none of them sticks out as the obvious right way. And even the DeepL version at the bottom, restless, not a problem with that. Second piece of vocabulary or word was Ungeziefer, whether you translate it as insect, vermin, cockroach, or also vermin is equally up for debate. So the point is not whether or not the neuro-machine translation is good in this context, but rather that it provokes some reflection on the part of students. And for those of you who are also active teachers or instructors, it'd be my suggestion is you try to facilitate that sort of thing where there's less of a value judgment of these tools or assistance, but rather if you can get it to provoke more reflection on the translation process. Right, so next, the preliminary results that I would like to derive from the student exposure would be, first of all, my hypothesis that the student exercise revealed different focuses. So those that were just doing human translation were often more focused on the correctness of their understanding of the source text, whereas those who are post-editing, as it were often more focused on the target text. And it revealed different ways of reading. One positive effect is that in instruction and teaching settings, it can be used to overcome basic language limitations. My students are beginners and don't necessarily always have very good skills in their target language, in this case, English. And the shifts focus from the source text to the translation text. And finally, of course, if you're having a lively seminar setting, you always would welcome some degree of interpretation and correct reading of the text, discussion of that. The third case study was a situation that I was in pre and during the pandemic. And that was in 2020. I was a speaker in a workshop setting, 2 gatherings of professional technical translators, and I confronted them with literature. The content and structure of these workshops were nearly identical, even there was some overlap in terms of the participants. In the first case, it was the ATA German section annual meeting in Erfurt, Germany, and the section 1 was the German Association of Interpreters and Translators, BDU, a Translate Better conference, which was held in near Salzburg, Germany. Both of them were in former monasteries. I'm not sure if this was a direct reference to St. Jerome, but we did try to channel him in some way. The participants were almost all very experienced translators with some degree of specialization, whether it was in medical, legal, or other translation, and were quite adept at using CAT tools and to some extent also NMTs. So what I had them do was I forced them to choose one of 3 text variants, either an excerpt from the novel, as you will know from the slide before, Spring Awakening by Isabel Lane, which I also did with the students, and an excerpt from a review of the movie Rise of Skywalker, and finally a German poem, An das Mittelmeer by Michael Vogel. And then once they had self-selected into one of these 3 text type groups, I had them once again divide into a subgroup that used NMT and one that did not. Just so an example of the type of challenges that are posed by using NMTs. Oops. In the poetry section, I've highlighted some words that created problems. On the first word, rausch, because it could have two different meanings, intoxication, but also the sound of the sea. Second one, Uration, it doesn't have a clear, immediately accessible equivalent. Anschmiegen, is it to cuddle, to caress, to get close. Zerbrach, here we have formatting issues. The word to break is broken. Ha ha ha. Oh, those poets. So these are all things that were not helped by machine translation, or were challenges. I won't go into detail for the purposes of time into a close analysis of what they did, but the preliminary results, what I gathered from their feedback as well as what they showed me, was that the helpfulness of the neural machine translation tools varied greatly, as one could expect. According to text type, even professional translators had difficulties with new text types, and while the machine translation post-editing group was faster and more efficient, it had unexpected errors. Finally, the non-MT group produced a more coherent, stylistic, adequate translation, but had some issues getting finished on time. Speaking of getting finished on time, I've got about 4 minutes left. So my pedagogical goal, and this is not my only tool in the toolbox, was to cause a sense of intentional irritation in the positive sense, to throw them off their typical game. And for the students, it is a fact that whether they already are encountering it as digital natives at the age of 10 or in school, at some point, we just have to acknowledge that for people learning to translate, that is some sort of water that they have been swimming in, and they are not only familiar with Google Translate DeepL, but they would like to use it. And so the question I had is, well, if they're using it, why? I should teach them how to use it well, right? So the second thing is that because of colleagues at the department who are of a different opinion, I am only letting them use NMT as an exception to the rule. And in exam situations, they are not allowed to use it. Finally, professional technical translators are rarely exposed to different text types. They may have had it many years ago, but once you're specialized, you often only do that. And I thought it was very remarkable how much positive feedback I got just to encounter, whether it was the poem or the short novel excerpt, to encounter something that made them aware of something that is not just segmentable. Great, so prognosis and future plans. I hope to continue to use NMT and post-editing in a teaching setting. However, I do not believe that I will be using it as the default way of translating, but as an augmented tool that in some settings, the students either in the university setting or later in professional settings would be able to use. So not necessarily the norm. And I find it important to have an ever-evolving definition of digital competence. This means not just using bound paper dictionaries and pencil erasers, but also the various things that will arise later on, whether it's the so-called translation app that I heard about this afternoon or something else. We should be open to progress in that way. For literary translation, I think it can be a good tool for those people in continuing education or in those settings who won't necessarily have it as a professional goal, but to expand their horizons. And lessons that could arise from that is having greater awareness for style register, narrative coherence, and voice, and not just thinking about the mistranslation or correct translation of segments and tokens. Right, so I timed it correctly, 20 minutes. Thank you for your attention. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions that go beyond what might come up right now, feel free to send me an email, and I would be happy to try to answer whatever you say. Right, this first chat, that's from before. Anna, or Antonio?
Yes, thanks, Bradley.
Yes.
Well timed and very interesting. There is a question for you already in the chat by Anna Strohe. And Anna is saying, in terms of the DeepL translation of Kafka, sorry, you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. In terms of the DeepL translation of Kafka, is the assumption that the text itself doesn't already form part of its learning corpus? Was that something that you talk about with students? Do you think that it matters in doing these activities with students, whether the empty products are, in between quotes, honest, so actually the result of original MT, or in quotes, influence, this is that the text might have been part of its training?
Good question, Anna. And it's complicated at least because I don't have any insight into the black box that is DeepL or Google Translate. I would say at the very most, there are some similarities between the Stanley Corngold translation from the 70s and possible influence of what is produced by that, perhaps because it's the most widely received and read translation, but there are, by my count, 8 different English language translations, and it doesn't seem, if you put the whole first chapter into various NMT machines, you do not get the sense that it's clearly oriented towards Corngold and very much not towards the first translation from 33. So no, Anna, I don't think there is very clear influence.
Can I just follow that up?
Yes, go ahead.
Sure.
So, and do you think that that actually matters in terms of how well the activity works and how students respond to this idea about, you know, using this kind of tool and thinking about translation? Was it something that you talked about at all with the students? Yes, and I tried to give them 2 contrarian notions. On the one hand, that I present, especially with the novel excerpt, situations where there are obvious mistakes and mistranslations, misunderstandings of the source text, etc., as we've seen in various presentations today. These are easy to find, but also with the example of Kafka, I show them, well, if you would do a blind test of DeepL's version of Kafka and compare it to some extent very idiosyncratic translations by humans, you would see that it's not to be assumed that the machine translation is worse. There may be, of course, needs for post-editing or close reading of a third kind, but yeah, that it shouldn't be thrown out with the bathwater. Does that answer your question all?
Yes, Anna says, thank you. So I don't see other question in the chat. So in the meantime, let me ask you something. So yeah, in your experiment with students, I got the impression that the translations were have different positive points. So the post-editing was better in a way, and the from scratch was better in different things, right?
Yeah, definitely.
So I have two questions in one. The
Okay.
first question is, then would there be a way to get the benefits of both translations, and whether the problems that arise in either post-editing or human translation, they could be, let's say, identified with this mode of translation or with the little experience of translation because they are students?
I would say that students are often fairly amorphous, and they can be taught basic tricks. But when it comes to very proficient post-editing, you would need to do that for more than the 15 weeks of a semester. So yes, it can be trained, and I think that the idea is to familiarize and make them acquaint them with the strengths and weaknesses of this tool, but also don't give the impression that they've got it figured out at the end of the semester.
Okay, thanks. There is a comment by Rachel McNichol. Thanks, Brad. Good to hear about practical case studies with both students and professionals.
If there are any people in the audience who may have experience with translation, teaching translation, I'd be wondering if any of you have also integrated the combination of literary translation and NMT for beginning students. Ha, James. I think everyone can read it, but basically the question is whether or not there's ever resistance from students. And I would say very rarely, like I mentioned in the beginning, in the middle of the presentation, almost all of them are familiar with this. It's something they have used secretly in school. Yeah, it's part of their world, and we need to see how it could be part of a adult professional world as well. All right, so I'm reading at least 2 positive feedbacks about other instructors who have created exercises for students and had good results. Okay. So Guillaume, the last comment also said that he had a bad result in that students automatically went for the machine translation. Perhaps there's some need for slight tweaking of expectations on their part.
Nice comments. We also ask students, so in a course, translation technology for master students in translation. So 1 week we were teaching them ways to evaluate translations, and we asked them to evaluate machine translations and human translations.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the questions at the end was, given these empty systems, you have seen this was for a short story by Vonnegut. We asked them, given these outputs, would you use any of these systems as a basis for post-editing? So we were expecting to see something like no, because the final quality wouldn't be that good. But all the answers were given for granted that the final quality would be good enough, and they were focusing on time, and they were saying yes because it would save me time. So this leads to a question. In our experience, the students seem to think that post-editing would lead to a very good quality output. So I think that maybe this is a risk, and I was wondering whether you see this with your students as well.
Yeah, and in particular when it's a time thing, not necessarily the exam itself, but if they're concerned about, or maybe it's getting towards the end of the semester and they don't have enough time for all the commitments they have, you do notice that shortcuts have been taken here and there, and it's important to really point out, okay, I noticed that if 80% of you did not change this sentence, were you just clicking yes, or were you post-editing or reading carefully? One thing I wanted to also mention is that something that I point out in a professional literary translation context, you almost always have an editor at the publishing house. This, of course, is a different kind of editing, the post-editing, but we shouldn't forget that and assume that what literary translators who use no tools produce is automatically printable, right?
Yeah, good points. And yes, it's echoed in the chat. Good point. Nice way to close this talk, since we are 2 minutes over time. So we close this talk and also the session. So thanks, Bradley, and thanks to all the speakers from the session and to the audience, of course. So it's the end of this panel, but not of the conference, of course. So it's...
Reiterate, if anyone has anecdotes, stories, or lessons you've learned in your professional instruction context, feel free to send me an email. I'm glad to sympathize or learn from you.
Okay.